everybody welcome Mehreen to the microphone?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're gathered on, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. As we all know, this land always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. And I must acknowledge and commend Antony and his group's work on this issue. I don't think the community knew much about the impacts of the incinerator until this group was formed and the awareness raising that has been done. And I guess the real resilience that the community has shown on this issue, I think will pay off sooner, hopefully, Antony, rather than later. Yes. And I think from the Greens' perspective, sometimes waste to energy can be a vexed issue politically. And I say that because this waste to energy incinerator is kind of sold as a step up in the waste hierarchy of avoid, reduce, reuse, recycle, treat, dispose. And it's often said that, oh, well, it's better than landfilling waste at least. But of course, we know that the reality is quite different, that those are not the only two options we have in terms of how we manage waste, or rather how we waste our resources, I guess, if you look at it from another angle. But it is important that we also provide alternatives to what is being proposed. And I come to them a little bit later on in my talk, but I do want to talk a little bit more about what the incinerator itself is. And it is being called the world's largest garbage incinerator, which is being proposed for the Eastern Creek in Western Sydney. And as Antony said, if it's built, it will at full capacity be 1.34 million tons of waste every year. That's 3,500 tons of waste every day, which equates to 350 garbage trucks every day. And if you compare it to European nations, and often people say, oh, but there are incinerators there. Well, there hasn't been a new one built in many years. And also the incinerators, the largest one is less than half the size of what is being proposed from Western Sydney. So in New South Wales, we'll go from no incinerator now to the world's largest incinerator if this goes ahead. And to me, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And the company behind the incinerator is Mr. Ian Malouf's Dial a Dump. And some of you might know that this company operated the landfill at St. Peter's, which has now been taken over by the WestConnex, where this proposed St. Peter's interchange, the monstrosity is going to be, sadly. But this company, in its time when it was operating that landfill from 2001, has breached license conditions about 18 times. And on top of that, the government had to pay $50 million to remediate that site. And that remediation process has caused so much angst to the community because there's massive odors being released every single day. So I don't think it's a company that's known for its best practice, to be really frank. And no wonder that the community is really concerned about the pollution aspect of the incinerator, but I think there is real concern also about who is actually putting this proposal in, who the proponent is. As Antony has said already, really massive community opposition to the proposal. In fact, to the latest development application, there were 990 submissions made, and 949 of these were objections to the incinerator. And basically on the principles of air pollution and the impacts on human health. At the moment, I'm sitting on a parliamentary committee that is actually investigating this proposal of energy to waste, and also the whole idea of energy to waste, and whether that actually has any applicability in this day and age. And at one of the hearings of the committee, where the CEO of Dial a Dump was present, so this is not the owner, but the CEO of the company, and I asked him the question what he thought about the community's opposition, given that there were so many submissions made against it, and whether he thought that the company had social license to build and operate in Western Sydney. And his response was that he understood that the community was concerned, but then he said this, and I quote exactly what he said. He said, whether they are rationally based or reasonably based is another issue. So now I'll give you the facts, and you can make up your own mind whether you think the community concerns are reasonable or not. So the project will consist of 2 100-meter tall exhaust stacks, which will continuously spew out pollution. As Antony has said earlier, the site is within only 800 meters of some homes in Minchinbury, and then a few kilometers from all these other suburbs like Clare, Colleton, Erskine Park, Mount Druitt, Rooty Hill, Blacktown, Penrith. And it's also within just 5 kilometers of the Prospect Reservoir, which is where a lot of our water drinking water comes from. The environmental impact assessment clearly indicates that there will be a number of toxic gases released from the incinerator, like hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and there will be emissions of heavy metals like mercury, cadmium, arsenic, chromium, and there will be dioxins and furans. And the Environmental Protection Authority itself and the New South Wales Health have made submissions on the proposal. The EPA found that human health risk assessment provided in the application was pretty generic, and if I can use the word crap, it was pretty crap, basically. And it wasn't site-specific at all. The EPA conducted their own review of the human health risk assessment and found that it did not meet Australian guidelines. So that doesn't really give you much confidence in what the proposal is about, and whether the community community saying that it was reasonable to say that we oppose it was in fact a rational thing. New South Wales Health, in their submission to the proposal, said that the proposal to build and operate an incinerator within city limits is not consistent with over 100 years of environmental regulation to improve urban air quality by removing incinerators and power stations and other sources of pollutants from urban areas. We note that this plant is double the size of similar plants overseas, and we require assurance that appropriate environmental controls are in place and effective in the long term. And obviously, they haven't been provided that assurance as yet. So these all look like pretty rational concerns to me. But what I've seen in the last 4 years since I've been in Parliament is that there is this real arrogance from big industry to really ride roughshod over the community. And perhaps the reason for that is that they've actually got used to getting their own way most of the time, and for too long, when governments of both colors have been easily influenced by big money, by big business, and by vested interests. And I think that's at the crux of it. That's something that really needs to change in New South Wales. And as I mentioned earlier, I currently sit on this inquiry into energy to waste. And as well as hearing overwhelming concerns from the community and the experts, one thing that really struck me is that burning waste was actually being considered to be renewable energy. And like Antony, I don't see it as that at all. Because, although we can't be sure of commercial and confidence information, I did ask questions about whether the Clean Energy Finance Corporation was actually funding this proposal, because I know that they have been looking into funding similar but smaller proposals in, I think it's Western Australia, Anthony, if I'm right, yep. I find that it's absolutely absurd to call burning rubbish renewable energy. And even more absurd for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to lend money to these kinds of projects at the expense of genuine renewable energy like solar and wind. So there were obviously lots of health concerns, but really the real concern about this proposal also was that it could effectively monopolize waste disposal in Sydney. The Waste Contractors and Recyclers Association of New South Wales, for instance, said that the claim by the proponent that there is an appetite of about 1.3 million tons of commercial and industrial waste for feedstock is not credible. That's what they said. And the concern there is that what might end up happening is that the material that might be able to be recycled might end up in the incinerator being burnt. So that's like a real waste of precious resources that could be reused or recycled. So like you heard earlier, I'm a civil and environmental engineer, so managing materials, resources, and waste has always been a keen interest of mine. But I have to say that waste at the moment is a pretty hot topic, and it was made sexy by the Four Corners expose, I must say. And hopefully many of you did see that in March this year, and that exposed the huge amounts of recyclable waste. I think some estimated about 50%, which is being landfilled, or much of it is actually crossing the border to Queensland, and some of it is being stored in, I think, Victoria as well, they said. And yes, we know that Queensland does not have a waste levy, and that might be one of the reasons why trucks are crossing the border. But I think it's easy to blame that it's all the fault of Queensland government. Ultimately, we know waste here is the responsibility of New South Wales government. You just can't shift the blame on another state. And for this government, environmental management is a very low priority. It is like, I try and tell people that I haven't seen such an anti-environment government in my 25 years in New South Wales. I really haven't. And one small indication of that is that they have had 4 environment ministers come and go in the last 4 years that I've been in Parliament. It's just, they don't really care. It's hard to admit that, but there is really no care for the protection of the environment and the health of the community in that sense. And I have to say, I don't have much faith in the environmental regulator at the moment as well. The EPA has consistently, we had an inquiry a few years ago in the EPA, and again, the community's overwhelming, I guess, sentiment when they made their submissions was that they have lost trust in the regulator, and they thought that the EPA was too close to the industry, and they weren't listening to the concerns of the community. And I think that came very clearly through in the Four Corners program as well. And so after that Four Corners program, the Greens have been really strongly calling for a special commission of inquiry into this whole saga of waste. We still have this inquiry on waste to energy going, and that has been expanded a bit to include what was exposed in the Four Corners as well. And what was exposed in that program also was that we actually don't know how much waste is going to landfill, how much waste is being recycled. So we don't know how much will go up and what type of waste will actually be put into flames in the incinerator. And I think the expose also blew away any pretense that we can keep going down the trajectory of ever-increasing consumption. We can keep producing mountains of waste in the hope that we can recycle our way out of it. And just the end bit of my presentation, I want to talk about what we don't often talk about in waste, that there is a real issue of us being a throwaway society, the ever-increasing consumption in society. And that's a big part of the problem that we have as well. And we have to make kind of really big strides away from that if we are to move towards sustainability. We also have to end this dominance of always trying to find end-of-pipe approaches, like, okay, you can keep producing as much waste as you want, we'll put it in a landfill, or we'll burn it, and all will be good. It doesn't really work that way. We need to move up the chain, obviously, towards source control and a way of systems thinking, where we can see the links with consumption, with our behavior, with air pollution. I know it's more complex than trying to find really simple solutions. Yeah, but we have to think in a more connected manner. And there are many tools that allow us to kind of move up the hierarchy. And one of the ones that I speak a lot about is the idea of extended producer responsibility, which basically makes the producers of the goods responsible for the full life cycle of the good. And what that does is that because they are responsible, they actually start thinking more, because for them it's about reducing cost. And that works. So they start thinking about reducing material use, they start thinking about extended life of the product. So they don't get it back in 2 years' time, it breaks and you return it back, because now they're responsible for it. So they start thinking about designing for the environment. And it's that attitude of the industry that we need to change. Because I think industries need to start thinking that if it can't be reused or recycled, let's not make it. And that's really important. We have been in New South Wales and in Australia as well, we haven't done much on it, but countries like Canada and across the European Union, there are many companies who also supply products to us. They use extended producer responsibility in those countries because they have to. For example, a company like Dell, you can return your products to that company without having to pay anything and they will recycle or reuse material. Sorry?
But not in Australia.
Not in Australia, because we have, yeah, exactly. We have some sort of voluntary extended producer responsibility program, but it has never worked. It's been there for 10 years now, and it hasn't worked. So it's quite clear to me that this rush to burn waste without considering all the other myriad of alternatives higher up in the hierarchy will do nothing to stop the current so-called waste crisis. So the Western Sydney incinerator obviously must be opposed, and it would be great if people in Eastern Sydney join the campaign as well. It must be opposed because of reasons of pollution. It must be opposed because of reasons of the impact on human health on the people of Western Sydney. But it also must be opposed equally because of the disastrous role that it will play in further delaying our society moving to the end goal of actually eliminating waste. Thank you.